Here's an interesting question. Does an old game like Flashback, visually striking for its time, still look good in the year 2012? It's not just the protagonist's mom genes that make Flashback appear dated. The realistic illustrative style the game attempts clearly butts up against the limitations of the hardware of 1992. However, the lack of detail resulting from these same limitations, the posterized coloring, the blank-faced protagonist, give the game a timeless, expressionist quality. So the game dualistically epitomizes why older games do and do not hold up aesthetically. Games which aim for realism usually end up looking horridly dated, while games with a simple, abstracted visual design often stand the test of time. For one example, the video-captured characters of Mortal Kombat looked awesome at the time, but nostalgia notwithstanding, now look just awkward and silly. The effect is even worse for 3D games. Consider the garishly murky full texturing of Tekken 2 against the sparse clarity of Virtua Fighter. Or consider the stilted, realist, representational style of the first Resident Evil against the fluid, cartoony style of Crash Bandicoot on the same system. The sum effect is that many older games, known for their breakthrough visuals at the time, now kinda just look like ass. The original Half-Life, for example, or Max Payne, once bleeding edge, these games now seem blurry, blocky, and ridden with odd artifacts. Observing this dynamic, many developers of late, particularly smaller ones, have eschewed the cutting-edge realism that they don't have the budget to pull off anyway, instead favoring cartoony, illustrative, and even painterly aesthetics. Gearbox, notably, quite likely doubled their sales and launched a franchise when they simply retouched the original yawn-inducing realistic art style of Borderlands with comic book-style coloring and line inking. In fact, arguably the biggest crossover successes of the industry have all been built on this key insight. The non-core gaming audience seems to strongly prefer simple, non-realistic graphics. But in recent years, many people have taken this observation about graphic styles one more step, arguing that better graphics, and the faster hardware that would make them possible, no longer matter. Developers, this argument goes, should live within the means of today's hardware and embrace those limitations as a satisfactory endpoint. This argument is not only wrong, but myopically so. While it's true that many existing games and innumerable games as yet unthought of work comfortably within the limits of today's hardware, just as many games, if not more, would significantly benefit from faster hardware, not just in terms of an improved aesthetic experience, but also in terms of new and improved gameplay. Faster hardware is not just about frivolous window dressing. Skyrim is a good template here. It's a very ambitious kind of game that could make use of faster hardware in all sorts of ways. For starters, this looks pretty damn good, doesn't it? But what we're seeing here is a lie. Looking into the far distance, numerous objects in the world don't show up. And it's not just rocks and trees, there might be characters moving on those hills which just aren't getting rendered because they're too far away. Sure, draw distances of today's games are miles, literally miles, better than the draw distances of early 3D games, but the distant rendered scenery in our games are still just that, mere scenery. Distant views, or the absence thereof, are no longer a jarring distraction from the player's focus on the middle and near distance, but like movie backdrops, they don't stand up to real scrutiny. More importantly, the player can't see, say, the dragon on the mountaintop in the far distance. It would be nice if, one day, players could look into the distance and assume that they are seeing everything that is supposed to be there. Today, that's just not a safe assumption. I find lack of distant detail particularly troublesome in racing games. When traveling at fast speeds, it's very important to perceive as much detail as possible far down the road so as to anticipate the precise bank of a curve or road conditions, or the moves of other drivers, and so forth. While in real life, your eyes naturally gather full resolution detail precisely where your eyes are looking, in a game the distant road occupies just a small narrow band of the screen, and it doesn't help that the sheer angles of the polygons create a lot of jaggies and texture noise. Consequently, contrary to what many people assume, 1080p is not the end-all be-all of resolutions. Yes, it's true that most movie watchers have trouble discerning 720p from 1080p, but games are not movies. A movie almost never expects the viewer to focus on and accurately perceive small details in the distance the way that, for example, racing games do, or flight sims do. So the rendering of distant views could stand to benefit from not just more geometry detail, but super high definition resolutions and more anti-aliasing and texture filtering, all to allow the player to better perceive what they're actually trying to look at in the scene. More geometry and texture detail, of course, also matter for the near and middle distance. The reason most games don't allow you to enter or see into many rooms and buildings is because there's nothing there. I, for one, would like to see an open-world game like Assassin's Creed, in which every building and every room has a fully modeled interior. And even in today's best-looking games, the level of geometry and texture detail sharply falls off up close. Rage had this problem particularly bad. The sum effect is that our game worlds produce fantastic screenshots, but feel like movie sets, where every building is just a facade, and every piece of furniture is just a cheap hollow prop. Environments that stand up to close inspection would not necessarily just be eye candy. Real-world environments contain many objects with complex detail and interactions. Imagine that same dynamic in a game, like say a detective game, where you must really use your eyes and reason to read a crime scene, not just click on the 2 or 3 inspectable objects. Obviously, creating increasingly more detailed worlds is just as much a production problem as a hardware and software problem, but I'm confident developers will learn how to cope. Once art assets reach a certain level of fidelity, it's likely we'll start seeing more asset reuse, much like props and sets get reused in movies. With a little bit of rework, you can make a lot of stock assets seem original for your production. If you played World of Warcraft, you probably remember how cool it was the first time you ran across the whole continent without any loads along the way. It's been over 7 years since Warcraft's first release, and now loading barriers just feel clunkier than ever. With faster hardware, more games could stream in the same way that Warcraft does, and maybe even take it further. What if, say, Skyrim not only had seamless transitions between interiors and exteriors, but also fast travel that didn't take you to a loading screen, but rather swept the camera up into the sky to a map view of the world, then swept back down to your destination. Another obvious deficient area in our current tech is physical simulation, especially for liquids and soft bodies. Imagine, say, a dynamically simulated flooding mechanic where water could crash through walls and ceilings. Or imagine particle systems that not only look pretty but allow for complex gameplay interactions, like, say, a poisonous gas cloud that believably expands and dissipates. As it stands, games can only fake these sort of things, with a lot of man-hours put into canned rigging. Better physical simulation could also play a greater part in animation systems, like, say, procedurally generated walking animations that properly account for uneven terrain, or mantling animations that cope with random obstacles. Such animations not only look neat, they affect gameplay. When you get frustrated with dumb AI enemies who don't chase you up small obstacles, that's partly a matter of the AI, but also probably a matter of their animation systems as well. Game developers generally avoid endowing AIs with behaviors they can't render in a way that isn't jarring. So better procedural animations could lead to more competent and more believable AIs. And speaking of AI, that's in itself another reason to want faster hardware. For one, faster hardware could allow games to better simulate perception, such that the player could just use common sense to judge whether their character is visible to the AIs or not. And then there's the modeling of sound, which could be better not just for the sake of AI perception, but the player's hearing as well. It can really matter to gameplay whether or not footsteps echo down a hall or get blocked by a wall. And when it comes to better physical simulation, there's of course always light. Sure, we've seen games with elaborate dynamic lighting, like Dead Space 2, but the way these effects are currently achieved is again with laborious canned rigging. In Portal 2, for example, the dynamic shadowing is only achieved with a special pre-baking process, which requires special work by the artists and environment designers. What developers really want is the ability to just stick all lights in a scene where they should logically go and have them behave as you would expect in the real world. But this lighting is only attainable with faster hardware. The next generation of consoles will be fast enough to run global illumination schemes, which are the next big step until hardware becomes fast enough to reach the ultimate goal, which is probably some form of real-time ray tracing. These advanced lighting schemes will not only make games look better, they will actually make games easier to produce, and therefore, presumably, contribute to the development of better games. Lastly, more processing power is necessary to drive the more interesting input and output peripherals on the horizon, like Kinect-style full-motion body control or VR. The reason why Kinect today is mostly terrible is partly due to the inadequacy of the sensor device, but also due to the inadequacy of the processing in the current model of the Xbox. Interpreting the sensor data is non-trivial, and throwing more processing power at the problem would make for a significantly more responsive experience. Likewise, virtual reality and 3D on televisions both can be currently done with today's hardware, just not at speed and resolutions that make the experiences really worthwhile.